All right, so we are going to talk about the funding freeze, the unfreeze, the unknowns around federal funding, and what are some very specific actions to take. So that's what we're shifting gears from Super Bowl. We're shifting gears from the snow in Florida. We're even shifting gears from how happy we are that Nettie can see. And we're going to talk about this. So we'll dive in there in a moment. Couple quick notes here. This event is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. A lot of you are using these webinars to sort of amp up your CFRE credits, get CFRE approved. Great work. Love to help you out there. So that's what this is for. We've added a question at the end of the survey to certify your participation. Here is the agenda. So just a quick note on the agenda and the whole session today. We made this on an extremely short timeline, right? So last week, we dove in on, oh gosh, I think AI. Did we do AI last week? I think we did AI. So much has happened. So last week we dove in on AI, and we told you that 2 weeks after that, 2 weeks after last week, we were going to do a special on stock giving and major donors. And then the whole world sort of got a little crazy. And so we've added this as a last minute additional webinar for you, which has put us on super short notice. And so a couple things we're going to see. It's going to be a little bit shorter just because we haven't had as much time to do weeks and weeks of research that we would normally do. But we're going to really pull out exactly what happens. As you see here, we're going to talk about, okay, this is a trend, right? Instability in federal funding is a trend. What are the other trends? And how are these all intersecting? And so that's going to shape our strategy. And then we're going to talk about tactically, what are some very specific things you should do this week to start working on new plans. So that's what we're going to do here today. We're so happy to have you here. So just apologies in advance. It's going to be a little shorter. There are some things that we normally see where we normally survey the group in advance. We didn't do that this week because we're on a tight timeline. And we're probably going to have a couple spelling errors. So just apologize in advance. We're moving quickly. Okay, quick intro. Some things haven't changed. I'm still Patrick, still the co-founder of FreeWill, alongside my dear friend Jenny, who is potentially the smartest person I've ever met. Jenny's out in Seattle. I am in the great city of New York City today. I'm thrilled to be here. A little bit cold, but sort of bright, sunny cold. I just walked my dog for half an hour before doing this. So we are doing great. We get to work at FreeWill, which is the biggest estate planning and plan giving company in the world, trusted by almost 2,000 nonprofits, including many of you. Big shout out if that's you. Thank you so much. Featured in lots of different news articles for those of you that are old enough to remember what newspapers are. So we've got that going for us. And yeah, I'll get to work alongside really wonderful people. We used to be, by the way, we used to be in New York City until March of 2020, and then gradually we moved to a fully remote team. So now we have about 230 folks on 3 different continents, which is crazy to me. $11 billion raised to date, 2,000 partners, over 5 centuries of combined fundraising experience. A lot of the sort of best thoughts of the whole team go into a presentation like this. So I just want to give a quick shout out to the folks at FreeWill that are doing this. Okay, last thing before we get started. We like to give away some of my favorite books on this. And we're going back to the thing we gave at the beginning of the year, which is the Daily Stoic. Daily Stoic, a particularly useful, a particularly great book on days when the world is changing around you, right? Control what you can control. Don't stress about everything else and move forward. So this is by Ryan Holiday. I love it. It is timeless. It's like it's a single short reading every day. Some of you have read it. And so a lot of folks have read it. Feel free to basically request this, and we will send a copy to 20 people, and let us know where to send it. So hopefully you get that. If not, obviously available at your local bookstore. But this is a really good chance to sort of take care of yourself, right? This is a good week here. Okay, quick note before we start, because we are mostly talking about executive orders that happened 2 weeks ago and a whole bunch of chaos that happened last week. I found some of these executive orders to be disappointing, infuriating, sad, terrible. Many of you have had similar experiences. Some of you didn't. But it's like a deeply emotional week. I think particularly for me, hearing about some of the closures at USAID have been really hard. This session is not going to be a lamentation, right? Instead, what we're going to do is really talk about practical steps to do it or not. So just want to name that up front, right? We're not going to run sort of constant commentary the whole time in terms of the moral values of each of these things, because we could, but what we really want to do is help you be prepared for moving forward, and that's what we're going to do this as well. All right. So first part of the agenda. What the heck just happened? Right. So going back to now, what feels quite a long time ago. Um, Inauguration happens on January 20th. This is now 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. During his first week in office, Trump signed dozens of executive orders affecting everything from immigration, climate change, and oil exploration to health and medical research, as well as eliminating federal diversity programs, directives defining gender, and much, much more. On Friday of Inauguration Week, the State Department issued what we call a stop work order on Friday for all existing foreign assistance and paused new aid, sparking a steady stream of individual notices to aid groups and the UN agencies telling them to halt specific programs. Right. So that was the first sort of movement here. Then on Monday, this is now 8 days ago, right? So a week ago yesterday, 8 days ago, they announced a funding freeze. The Office of Management and Budget, what we call OMB, released a memo to the heads of all executive departments and agencies of the federal government requiring a temporary pause in all activity and a mandatory review of all funded agencies and programs. The memo requires a mandatory review of all federal programs and funding streams before funds can be dispersed again, right? So Monday, chaos starts. A lot of organizations like yours may be panicked, understandably. The goal of this, in their telling, was to ensure compliance with new administration priorities, but the rollout was abrupt and left agencies, nonprofits, and businesses scrambling. So there was confusion outside the administration, and now we know there was confusion inside the administration as well. Without clear guidance, the announcement sent shockwaves through the federally funded organizations, creating uncertainty around which programs were affected and which were not. Then on Tuesday, continuing, the pause affected a wide range of federal financial assistance, including grants, loans, and reimbursements. It disrupted operations for nonprofits, for states, and for businesses. Only a handful of programs, Medicare, Social Security, and direct individual aid, were explicitly exempt from the freeze, leaving everything else in limbo. But even Medicaid had their online portals shut down. Agencies and grants recipients struggled to determine whether they continue operating, leading to a cascade of funding and service disruptions, right? We're all still on Monday. Many organizations fear that critical services from education to public housing to housing assistance and public health would be halted indefinitely. Then, before we even get there, federal grantees, including nonprofits and universities, often receive stop orders from their funding agencies, preventing them from accessing previously approved funds. Healthcare providers, including community health centers, Medicaid reimbursement, and other things remain closed, despite an FAQ later clarifying that Medicaid was not subject to the freeze. Agencies were handed a 52-page review document listing thousands of specific programs for internal evaluation, but no instructions on how to evaluate them, right? So thousands of programs need to evaluate, no clarity on how to evaluate them. And this threatened essential benefits, including SNAP benefits, which are food assistance for folks that don't know it, rental assistance, student financial aid, causing widespread alarm. That's Monday. Tuesday, obviously that confusion continues. The confusion quickly led to legal challenges as a coalition of nonprofits in particular filed for emergency restraining order. On January 28th, 2025, a federal judge issued an immediate stay, temporarily blocking the funding halt and scheduling a full hearing for February 3rd. State attorneys general from multiple states, mostly Democratic states, also filed lawsuits arguing the freeze was an unlawful overreach and had bypassed necessary rulemaking procedures. Meanwhile, public and private sectors were in limbo, awaiting clarity on when their funding would resume. Right? Less than 48 hours after the freeze was announced, the administration reversed course. On January 29, 2025, OMB issued memos, M2514, a short two-sentence directive that officially rescinded the funding freeze with no further exploration. The move was seen as a direct response to growing legal challenges and widespread confusion and funding recipients. And while the freeze itself was lifted, many organizations have already suffered operational disruptions with paused projects, unpaid invoices, staff uncertainty, et cetera. Why did the administration pull it back? We think because they didn't want to have a legal fight over this and instead wanted to later go to court on their own terms across the board. So what happens now? Although the full funding freeze is gone, other executive orders affecting federal funding remain in place, meaning some funding restrictions may still apply. Certain agencies have already begun cutting off funding from specific programs before the memo was issued, signaling a broader shift in funding priorities. and many organizations that rely on federal funding still face uncertainty as agencies continue conducting internal reviews of programs and grants, right? So that's what happened. By the way, yesterday, I believe, the National Council on Nonprofits won an additional lawsuit, which further pushed back the funding freeze. So just want to pause for a second and briefly shout out that group, as well as many other state, local, and national coalitions of nonprofits who've been really pushing back on this and doing really great legal work. So big shout out to folks across the board. So what happened, right? What do we know? What did we learn this past week besides just the facts of what happened? So that's the facts of what happened. What are some lessons we want to take away? First, the Trump administration styles itself as decisive and in favor of significant change over cautious incremental change. It is often unpredictable, even to people within the administration, right? So I cannot sit here and predict for you the next 10 steps they will take, because I bet that if you poll people within the organization, they wouldn't be able to predict the 10 steps they'll take. Sudden shifts like this may be the norm over the next 4 years, with the first 2 years likely to be the most eventful. Now, why the first 2 years are most eventful? Well, if you go all the way back to our Prepping for 2025 session, one of the things we said is that not only is there executive power, and clearly this administration is very interested in using executive orders and executive power over legislative shifts, but there will also be potentially significant legislative changes where executive orders cannot be used, things like taxation and even overall budgeting. Now, for the next 2 years, we have with almost certainty what we call a Republican trifecta, which means Republicans are in control of the Senate, the House, and the presidency. Now, if I were a betting person, and I don't bet on politics, but if I were, I don't bet on other things either, just for the record. But if I were a betting person, I would expect Democrats to retake the House, but not the Senate in 2026. A 30-second version of why we think that's a reasonable view is historically, the party not in control has significant success in the House, in particular, in the midterm elections. Why not the Senate? The Senate tends to be a little bit more affected by which states are up for election, whereas in the House, every state is up, every state and every district, every district is up for election. Now, and so given an extremely narrow majority for Republicans right now in the House, you would think Democrats might win 4 or 5 seats. Now, that's setting other things aside. The other thing that was really interesting coming out of the 2024 elections is that historically, Republicans have overperformed among frequent voters. So if you go back in the 90s, the early 2000s, the 80s, the 70s even, Democrats won when more people voted and Republicans won when fewer people voted. That's because Republicans were the party of the more educated, the wealthier, and often the older. Yet that script has flipped, and now Democrats tend to be voted most heavily by people who are voting a lot, who are the most politically engaged, who tend to be older, who tend to be more educated. This is what your midterm election looks like. Your midterm electorate is looks much more Democratic than your presidential elections, which have become more Republican over the years. So that's just a little bit of quick political analysis to give you a sense of what we should expect in 2 years, and then the following 2 years as well. Now, the Trump administration these aren't dumb folks, right? They're very thoughtful, they're very smart, they're very tactical, and they also know this. So they're saying, okay, look, we've got really 2 years, and in many cases, the first 100 days tends to be the most influential of a presidential term. So give you a sense there as well. Okay, what else? We also know that certain areas of funding will be under attack. This is not going to be a surprise. DEI initiatives, climate change initiatives, public health, especially reproductive health, international aid, excluding some weapons transfers to Egypt and Israel, although potentially that could even get drawn down, immigrant and refugee assistance. We also may expect increases in some areas based on what we know happened in the first Trump administration, things like job training and workforce development, small business support, potentially some other avenues as well, right? So these are some things that we have a pretty high degree of confidence in, energy development as well. So what's the broader landscape, right? In a moment, we're going to talk about what do we actually do here, and then we'll leave a bunch of time for questions. But what's the broader landscape here? Well, the first thing to know is that a bunch of different things are moving in different directions and not all the same. So we've just covered for a bunch of reasons why government funding, and particularly federal funding, although some state funding is sort of follows the lead of federal funding, government funding becomes much more unpredictable. Now, historically, when government funding has shifted, foundation funding usually increases. So many foundations are likely to increase funding and look to fill gaps, and many foundations are going to look to change their strategies. So we'll talk more about foundations in a moment. But if you are thinking about looking for new funding opportunities, this is an ideal time because foundations are in rapid change mode, which is not historically true. They're very slow-moving organizations. We also know that with the exception of some brief spurts of giving, small dollar fundraising is in what we call secular decline. It is likely to continue its decline due to the continuation of Trump tax policy that makes giving more expensive compared to previous years. What do I mean by that? I mean that because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has its pluses and its minuses, one of the big shifts is that we're now down to 10% of Americans itemizing their taxes and 90% not, which means that giving normal cash small donations has no tax benefit for 90% of donors. And so it actually becomes more expensive than it did 10 years ago, right? It's actually rapid inflation among the cost of giving charitably because I don't get that tax benefit I used to. We've talked a lot about that in other sessions. We won't go into it now, but just trust me on this. It's part of the reason that small dollar donations are decreasing. Now, what's been filling the gap is major giving, right? So we're seeing major giving continuing to grow with particular emphasis on non-cash giving, stocks, donor advised funds. We're seeing a sharp rise in giving out of an IRA. This is called a qualified charitable distribution. We expect 2025 to be the strongest ever year for donor advised fund grants. We also expect it to be the strongest ever year for qualified charitable distributions. Why is that? Two reasons. One, market performance. Two, the number of people eligible for QCDs is larger than it's ever been in history. So those two reasons. Third reason, more people have IRAs, right? So that's possible as well. So those three reasons will make it even more likely. And then lastly, bequests. So these are growing quickly due to demographics and asset prices. I was on the phone with a reporter the other day. We were talking about the Great Wealth Transfer, and I told him, look, there's only three things that matter in bequests, and we know that two of them are totally true already. One is how many people are getting older, all-time high, right? And we've talked a lot about that in other circumstances. Two is, are asset prices higher than they used to be? Housing prices, stock prices, et cetera. How much wealth are these folks holding? And then three, this is in your control, are nonprofits asking for these gifts, right? Those are the three things that matter. And so really interesting. We expect 2025 to be the strongest ever planned giving year. Recollect, by the way, that in the last Lilly Giving USA report from Indiana University, bequests were the only type of giving that outgrew inflation, right? So bequests are on the rise, pretty sharp. Okay, so now that's a lot on sort of how the world is working, and we've got overlapping trends, and some of them are up and some of them are down. And what it does is when we understand where we are in the world and where we are in this moment in time, then we can start to create some strategies. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 different things I think you should be thinking about. Then we'll do some very quick announcements, and then we'll get to some questions, and we'll probably end a little bit earlier today. So a brief moment on strategy, sort of a meta point before we get into some practical things. It is very tempting to sit and wait and do nothing, and that is not a plan, right? So you can panic, but you cannot freeze. And I recall, we've been talking with our team all week here, and Jenny, my co-founder who you saw earlier, and others, and I sort of sit here and we say, the last moment that was a shock to the system with a lot of unknowns that is similar to this is early COVID, right? Remember, some of you were working at your same organization, different organizations, March, April, May. And suddenly your gala got canceled. If you were a college, rent and a room and board payments dried up immediately. If you were a museum, obviously ticket sales dropped off a cliff. And we saw 2 types of organizations. Some organizations just froze in place. They didn't know what to do. And other organizations said, okay, if this is true, what ought we to do now? and they started making plans earlier, and those organizations really thrived. And so this is another moment where it's, you can be worried and you can be stressed. Do not freeze and do not stop investing in the things you're investing in. Do not stop, building the relationships, having the conversations, et cetera. Right. So important note there. First thing. Okay. So that's our meta point, philosophical point. Hopefully you guys get that. Strategy one, take a hard look at your foundation strategy and start expanding it. So historically, foundations tend to both increase their funding and change their funding strategies when government shifting changes dramatically. Government funding. I told you there would be a typo here. Government funding changes dramatically. The way you should think about this is we want to be findable and we want to be fundable. What does that mean? It means we want to be on the web. We want to have a clear view on what programs we're doing. And we want to be fundable, right? We want to make it clear that we're having clear impact and that we're ready to apply for grants across the board. This is an extremely opportune time to build new relationships with foundations and look for new grant opportunities. Historically, grant opportunities are most present. The most new grant opportunities show up in Q2 and Q3, which if you're not sort of lost in business speak, as many of us are, Q2 starts in April. It's April, May, June. Q3 is July, August, September, right? That is the bulk of new funding opportunities over the course of the year. And so be ready for that. Q2, excuse me, is only about 7 weeks away. So start to look at new foundations, start to look at new opportunities as they come online. This is a really good chance to potentially get new funders that you haven't historically gotten. So big opportunity here. One strategy as you think about looking for new funders is what we call a lookalike approach. You can browse 990's annual reports of similar organizations. If you're an animal shelter and you're in Dallas, figure out who's giving money to the animal shelter in Fort Worth, right? If you're a religious college, think about who's giving money to the colleges of similar denominations. You can also look at lookalike organizations by seeing which other organizations are funded by the foundations that fund you, and then go look at their other funders, right? So you get a better sense of, okay, who's in this world generally? This tends to be quite useful. Just a small note that our marketing team wants me to share, but is a really important thing is that we have this new tool called Grant Assistant, which is launching the most comprehensive and the most usable list of funding opportunities. It's searchable with AI instead of filters. And so instead of trying to be like Kentucky and healthcare and then read through 2,000 options, you might say, we're a healthy living facility in Lexington and we're looking for funders that do X. And then it will just pull the best matches for you. It's close to magic, and we strongly suggest that you look it up. They have a new feature on top of being able to write grants for you, to be able to find grants for you. The launch of that got sped up because so many people are needing it right now. So you can go check that out. Just make a note in the survey if you're interested. Okay, strategy two, review and reframe your federal state funding. So look, the number one rule of marketing, of donor relationships is know who you're talking to. And who you were talking to in the Biden administration is different than who you were talking to in the Trump administration. And as my old boss, Barack Obama, used to say, elections have consequences. And so this has shifted. This has shifted, right? The Trump administration has starkly different priorities from the Biden administration, and many red state funders are going to follow suit. So take a look at the executive orders around DEI, climate, immigration, AI, et cetera, and work to reframe your programs in this language. Now, you might not always love doing this, but I promise you it's going to give you a better chance at winning funding. Many nonprofits are already doing this. And so not all of these are my ideas, but I've sort of read these around the internet. People talk about moving disadvantaged groups to lower income groups in the community. People talk about moving climate change to disaster response. People talk about renewable energy. Instead, they're talking about energy abundance. Financial inclusion. Maybe we're talking about increasing opportunity or job training or workforce development, things like that, right? And you don't have to change so much of your work, but you are going to have to change the frame of it a little bit. Now, one of the things that our team is stressed right now because we know that you're stressed, and so we're working around the clock to try to help. One of the things we made is a totally free, let me just name it, extremely free tool for you to review your government-funded programs in light of recent executive orders. So what you do here is you upload a description of your programs. It will flag areas that you might want to reframe before you submit or request funding. It's free and it's open for anyone to use, right? So FreeWill partner, not FreeWill partner, no problem. This is just a tool that you might need at this moment. My friend and colleague, Mustafa and the grant assistant team worked crazy hours this weekend to make sure it was ready for you on Tuesday. So just wanted to give a big shout out to Mustafa there. Um, and then also I need to tell you it's not legal advice, right? So do not, use it, gain value from it, but we need to tell you it's not legal advice. I'm actually going to show it to you very quickly because we have just a moment here. So you can see here it's an executive order analyzer. We'll send a link to this out after it. You input a bunch of details, it starts, and then it will analyze basically for you what it is, right? So we won't do a full demo, but it's very, very cool. And so take a look at that. We think it's really special. And it's free for everyone. So feel free to share it with your peers, et cetera. Okay, a quick little bonus strategy before we get into our fourth strategy is check in on corporate grants. Now, we've had a lot of conversations. FreeWill, we talked to about, I don't know, 150 nonprofits a day, every day. So we do a lot of listening here. And one of the things we're hearing is that many publicly traded companies are backing away from being extremely vocal about DEI out of fear of retaliation by the Trump administration. They basically think that they could get attacked and it could really cost them money or jobs. And so they're just being a little quieter about it than they used to. If you get regular corporate grants, and especially if it's in any of these categories that we've talked about, reach out now to see if their funding strategies are shifting. In many cases, they may change the name of the grant, but they still may fund the exact same things, right? So you have this whole game being played where people are being a little bit less obvious about what they're funding, and yet they're still funding it. In other cases, they may want to continue to fund, but they may ask for a change in recognition, right? So all of this needs to be taken into account. So go chat to, if you have regular relationships with corporate funders, this is a good time to go check in on them, see how they're doing, right? These are all just people at other organizations, and have a quick conversation with them about what they need to be able to continue to fund you and do your important work. So hopefully that's helpful as well. Last thing here, or strategy 3, we're not even there yet, increase your focus on major giving. So again, we talked about these sort of various headwinds and tailwinds, and it's extremely clear to us that there is a long-term trend shifting in funding from major giving, to major giving from small dollar giving. Small dollar giving is getting smaller every year. Major giving is getting larger every year. There's no signs of this slowing down, and demographics and economics and tax policy all point in this direction. So we need to get smart about major giving. And those of you that are growing much faster than those of you that are not. This is a very good chance to use this moment to transparently and clearly communicate with your board members and your major donors about how funding might affect you. Transparency really matters here. It builds trust, it builds support. Also remember, this isn't a thing that's happening on its own. All these trends are going to play. There's $250 billion sitting in donor advised accounts. This money has already been allocated to charitable giving, but not yet to which charity, right? So it's a great chance to do it. It's also a great moment to solicit stock gifts. Even though we have a little brief, crazy 24-hour tariff hiccup, the markets have been very strong over the past 12 months and extremely strong over the past 40 years. And so soliciting stock gifts tend to be extremely large gifts. I'm not going to read all this out to you, but we drafted templates for you to send to your board. Obviously, you're going to have to change it for your organization, but just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I'll give you a moment to read it. And then we've also, here's the rest of the board email, by the way. And then similarly, we've drafted an email to you, to your major donors or all of your donors. So you can have this and you can copy and paste it when you get the PDF. So Marissa asks whether the presentation will be shared, and yes, of course. So we were going to get you these templates and you can copy it as well. These are really good opportunities. So I think I'm a little bit hesitant because I might get this wrong, but I think that my colleague Nicole Walton led on this. Nicole is an amazing part of our team. She's our head of major and planned giving strategy. She spent, I think, 15 years as the head of planned giving or in planned giving, and then the head of planned giving at Make-A-Wish National. She's unbelievably great. And so I just wanted to shout out Nicole, and I believe our whole content team there. So thank you, Nicole. You can just get a sense of everyone's just dropped what they're doing and try to be as helpful as possible. So that's the donor email. So take a look at that. Again, I'm just not going to read all of it, but you have it as well. Okay, strategy 4. So all of these things are happening. We can't sort of just throw our hands up. We need to keep pushing on major donors in particular. Let's go find new foundations. Let's check in on our corporate folks, and let's really drive really drive major giving, and you're going to find that that may be a great thing for you long term as well as near term. The last thing is continued advocacy, right? So the partial rescission of the funding freeze was due to overwhelming outcry across the nonprofit sector and others, right? So it's not only the nonprofit sector, we're going to give credit across the board. Please continue to highlight the negative effects of funding cuts to lawmakers. In particular, it is extremely clear to me that the Trump administration does not care what Democratic lawmakers think right now. And yet they are going to be really listening to local Republican lawmakers. So you want to reach out to everybody. You want to give Democrats that are arguing against this some fodder to talk about it. Again, you don't have to be a Democratic voter to do this, to have these opinions. You can, differ with everything. But in this case, if you're interested in having the federal government continue to fund nonprofits, these are the dynamics at play. Local Republican lawmakers, and by local, I mean relevant to you, not necessarily state-based. I mean your Republican senator, your Republican House members, about the impact on voters in your community. And you can look at it, think what areas are these House members or senators most likely to care about, right? So you might say, oh, it's really hurting our climate preparedness. But if they don't signal an interest in that, you might say, oh, it's really hurting our dairy farmers, and here's why, right? Or it's hurting our school kids, and here's why. So do this as well, right? So again, this is across the board. If anyone has sign-on letters from their local nonprofit councils, et cetera, let us know. You can shoot me an email. We'll try to highlight them on social media to make sure we get more eyes on it. We're lucky to have a big platform here as well, across the board. Okay, so we're going to wrap up there. A couple of resources. So my colleague Phoebe is going to, I'm going to pause the chat for a second so people don't lose it. Colleague Phoebe is going to drop a survey in the chat. Thank you, Phoebe. It's coming. I think so. There it is. Thanks, Phoebe. Sorry, Phoebe never knows when I'm gonna say that. So great work. So we're gonna send a copy of The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday to 20 people as a gift. So we would love to include you in those. Make a note in the survey, please, and do that as well. Other things that are in the survey are the templates that I just walk you all through, right? So you'll have that. Meaning, if you fill out the survey, we'll make sure to follow up with them. The executive order analyzer, again, totally free, that we're doing. And then third, if you're interested, Nicole, who I was just talking about, Nicole, who's wonderful, and Jack Hashett, also wonderful, don't mean to underplay Jack, are going to be doing a session in 2 days on diversifying your giving strategy. So as you think about branching out into more major donors and getting bigger gifts from these major donors, they're going to be showcasing some technology you can use to do that. This is, just so you know, this is much more about the tech that FreeWill offers. Obviously, this session is entirely educational, just to set expectations, but it's really interesting. And Jack and Nicole are so bright. Jack and I actually worked together at a previous company around getting sustainable food to families, which was really fun. And so I got to work with Jack for more than 6 years, and he's awesome. Also comes from a lineage of fundraisers. Some of you at Harvard or NYU will recognize his last name, as his dad was a sort of extremely well-known development director. Okay, so that's what we'll do on Thursday. So if you haven't already, please fill out the survey. Really, really appreciate that. And the next webinar is February 11th at noon. So again, this is just a week from now. We don't usually do them 3 weeks in a row, but big week. We got to cover it. And honestly, this next topic is potentially even more important for your long-term success. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about leveraging major donors, and we're going to particularly focus on some new research that we did in-house about stock giving. So stocks tend to be some of the biggest real-time gifts you'll ever get. And we have some new research based on looking at, I think, hundreds of thousands of 990s, as well as a bunch of our own internal work. And so that should be super interesting. So please, please come on that. Rebecca, by the way, says that she sent out an email this week, like the template you saw, and it was very well received. So lots of donors reached out. Great, great work. Okay. So that's what we have. We're going to spend, so we're a little bit earlier today. We're going to spend about 5 minutes on questions. Then we're going to just give everyone a chance to go back to work because there's so much going on. So thank you so much. Sarah says, what about the international funding freeze? Are all of these on domestic spending freezes? Sarah, the USAID saga is a fascinating one. Now, there's two questions that are both existential. One is, will USAID be shut down as an entity? There will be legal cases about that. Democrats are currently protesting, et cetera, et cetera. And then the second question is, if so, all of that funding has been allocated by Congress. It cannot be just stopped. And so are all of the same funds going to be allocated, but through the State Department is going to be mostly a sort of a linguistic shift, but actually the same things are going to happen? We don't know. The other question is, what does it mean for other international foundations and other countries, whether other countries will step up here? If I were you, if I was running an organization primarily focused on internationally, I would be doing a lot of the things we talked about. I'd be looking at other foundations. I would be expanding that strategy to look in other countries. And then I'd be looking at, really investing in major donors as well. So good questions. Um, Amy says, what is the individual giving level people need to itemize? So historically, Amy, just to put this in context, there is a standard deduction, which is now, I think, about $26,000 a year for a couple and half of that for an individual. Someone correct me if I'm wrong with exact numbers here, but roughly sort of 10, 13,000, and then double that for a couple. If you don't have enough individual deductions to get you above that, you do not itemize. And to say you take standard deduction, and so things that are in that category are how much state and local tax you pay, but that number got capped when the tax changes come. How much mortgage interest you pay, that's a big one, but that also got changed, that got pushed down, right? Third thing is charitable deductions, sort of unreimbursed work expenses, things like that. These all go into play, but for the most part, those state and local taxes and the mortgage deductions are what historically have pushed people above it. So good questions. Okay, another question. There's been legislation proposed to have a spend down on private family foundations or donor advised funds. Do we know where the administration stands on this? So right now, there is legislation that's already been in effect and has been for decades on private foundations. Private foundations have to give away at least 5% of their endowment every year. Now, this is a good thing. It's also a bad thing. Why is it a bad thing? It's primarily a good thing. But what it means is that most organizations say, okay, we're going to spend about 5% every year, and we're going to have this going in perpetuity. Now, the payout rate, how much money comes out of a donor advisement every year is way higher. It's more like 20 to 30% every year. Now, there may be a minimum threshold that we put in place, but that minimum threshold is probably going to be like 5 or 10%. And so the risk there is it actually creates different anchor points and people pay out less. So we'll see, but I don't have strong opinions on that. Someone says, bequest is not money that can be used right away. How does this help for 2025? Look, bequests are like the old Chinese proverb about the best time to plant a tree. Best time is 20 years ago. Second best time is today. Many of you have gotten bequests in recent years that are getting you through hard times when hard times show up. And so it's the big thing to know about bequests is they are going to be by far the biggest gifts you'll ever get. Just enormous sums, often from small dollar donors, often from people you've never even heard of. And so it's just a chance to get transformational gifts and really create an endowment that helps you long term. Great question. Kelly says, FreeWill is a great product for charitable giving, but estate planning, there's other things, right? What about medical decisions, next of kin, et cetera? We actually have additional documents that people can use to create for that. So great question. Anne says, how do we communicate this without being overtly political? Most of you have donors across the political spectrum. Some of you are more, your donors lean more conservative or liberal. I think you just say, look, like it's a moment of great uncertainty, right? You say, look, federal funding has been, there's clear signals that it might change at, short notice, and I don't think anyone would disagree with you there. You could talk, really put it in the facts, quote a news source, et cetera, and then say this is the impact it's going to have. So you don't have to, you know, go hard one way or another, but um, it's certainly the case that it's become less predictable and less reliable. And I don't think anyone would disagree with you on that. So good questions. Um, Natalie says, I work in New Jersey and in a county where I think all the mayors and county commissioners are Democrats, as are our congressional and both of our senators. In this case, who would be the local Republicans to reach out to? Um, Natalie, this is tough, right? You're not going to, there's basically not Republican, like, everyone's listening to their constituents. That's their job. It's not a negative. And so if you're, basically the folks that are already advocating against this, which is primarily Democrats, although there are House Republicans that I think, are speaking out against it or will, and are certainly going to speak out in favor of specific programs. Giving them evidence and sort of more context and more stories will be helpful, right? So, these are folks that are, they're going to be talking to the rest of the New Jersey delegation, which is not entirely Democratic. They're going to be talking to their peers, et cetera. Yeah, great question. Yeah, my home state of New Jersey. Okay. Human Yu says, Patrick, what about faith-based organizations? Is the current administration targeting faith-based laws and more? So this is a really interesting dynamic. If you're a faith-based organization, you're not getting a ton of federal funding, except if you are also a human services organization. So a lot of faith-based organizations do amazing work with soup kitchens and homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters and other things like that, right? So a lot of rehab, other things. I mean, just amazing work done by so many of these organizations. Net, the Republicans tend to favor faith-based organizations more than Democrats do, who are pretty cautious about, funding religious organizations with federal tax money. And yet you may also see potentially a hit to overall human services funding. So it's going to balance out. This is a really good opportunity to stay nimble, right? So look at avenues to be on your toes, ready when new funding opportunities come to play or when you need to reframe it and be able to reply quickly. So it's a big opportunity. But look, I mean, the federal government and its priorities are changing quickly, and this will happen again in 4 years, whether or not a new Democratic or a new Republican administration comes in. So this is something that we should be ready for generally, right? Many of you, some of you will be retiring in the next few years, but most of you will not. And so as we think about, presidential transitions, especially when they come with, flipping the Senate, flipping the House, whatever it may be, it's just a really big opportunity. Change is challenging. Famous saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. It's just, this is something that we want to be dealing with here. Eve says, our grant that was just awarded from NEA has disappeared from our portal. Have you ever heard of this happening? Eve, I would reach out to the folks you've been in contact with, the NEA. It has happened. I think you need to be ready for new grants coming up, for different grants, for things to be rescinded. I think you'll see a lot of shifts, so across the board. Okay, I think we're going to pause there. It's 12:50. We went a little bit over on questions, but there's a lot. Just wanted to say, obviously we appreciate you being here, and we appreciate the work you're doing. We're just thinking a lot about you, this week and last week and going forward. And we know it's a tricky time, and it's hard for many people who've gotten good at doing something particular, and then that thing, the rug gets sort of pulled from under your feet, and you have to do something totally different. And even if you succeed, it's still stress to just like turn on a dime. And so hopefully, some of these tools will be helpful and some of these trainings will be helpful. If there are other things that would be helpful, please let us know. You have my email address right there at the bottom. Shoot me a note on LinkedIn, whatever it may be. But we'd really love to hear. And we'd also love to hear how you're adapting. A lot of you are making lemonade out of lemons, and any stories that we can lift up to help inspire folks. I think one of the great things about our jobs and my job here is, we get to work with Christian organizations in Texas and animal shelters in Oregon and Ivy League schools and, museums in Florida and orchestras in Ohio, et cetera. And we just get to see all these amazing ideas, but a lot of these organizations don't cross-pollinate. So we can say, wow, well, this, the symphony in Florida did this. if you're a United Way in Madison, Wisconsin, you might want to think about doing something similar, even though that org's nothing like you. And so it's really cool. So any stories you have, please let us know. And just from the whole FreeWill team, we're thinking about you. Keep us up to date on what we can be doing better. And we'll see you there. So hopefully see many of you Thursday. And then also we'll see you on Tuesday for a deep dive on major giving. It's extra content this week. So have a wonderful week and talk to you all soon.